Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm the current chair of the Repositories Communities of Practice group. We're super happy to have you all here. I'm joining you today from Treaty 6 and the homeland of the Métis at the University of Saskatchewan. I just wanted to thank everybody who joined us over the summer for Journal Club. We're excited for our first official event of the new school year. We also have two new members, Carolyn Sullivan from the Université d'Ottawa and Sophie Saint-Cyr from the Université de Sherbrooke. So we're super happy to have them. And we'll be recording this event, so if you have colleagues who couldn't make it or you want to refer back to it later, we will have that for you. I'm just going to say our next event details will be announced soon, but we have it on 26 November, so I'll put that in the chat, and then also our usual feedback survey for events. So without further details logistically, I want to introduce to you Mike Nason. He is the Open Scholarship and Publishing Librarian at the University of New Brunswick. He is the Crossref and Metadata Publishing Specialist with PKP. He is the co-chair of the Scholarship Metadata and Discovery Expert Group. And in my experience, someone who cares a lot about understanding systems and making them work better and has been very generous with sharing his knowledge. So we thought it would be a fun way to start the year by giving everyone a chance to ask questions, big and small. And you came through with some really great ones. I'm excited to go through all of these with you. So I'll just say, since the event is already a Q&A, we're not going to have a formal Q&A period, but if you have questions that come up as we go along, Mike's happy to have sidebars, clarify details, those sorts of things. So put them in the chat or put up your hand. Mike's going to go through the questions with some slides he's prepared, and then I'll be around to keep us on track, keep an eye on the questions and anything like that if needed. But otherwise, Mike, feel free to take it away. Thanks so much for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily. I say thanks for people for believing that I have things worth hearing. I really appreciate it. I'm posting the deck in the chat, so if anybody wants it for later, and I will just share my screen real quick. I select the right thing. I didn't.
We can see your calendar right now.
Yeah, I picked the wrong thing. Hold on.
Okay, take time. That's
cool. Apple changed the way they do screen sharing in the new version, which I just installed this morning. So, classic. Okay, cool. So you folks asked me a lot of things, it turns out, and that's great. I love questions and I like helping people as much as I can. And yes, Tim, I am a busy guy. Sometimes I think I may be a little too busy. Yeah, I just want to thank folks for asking questions. And I'll try to keep things conversational as we go because I love a conversation and I like to keep things pretty casual. I've broken things into a few subcategories based on the kinds of questions we got. So we've got repositories and open scholarly infrastructure. Most of the questions were kind of in the space of discoverability, Scholaris specifically, PIDs, and then I made a section called Potpourri, and then a section called I don't really understand why anybody's asking me this question, but I'm going to try anyway. We're going to work our way through these in chunks, and then Emily's going to keep an eye on my rambling to make sure we don't get too far afield. So let's get poppin'. The first question that we got that I wanted to talk about a little is this one. What do you think is the easiest to accomplish big win we can achieve the next couple of years in this domain? Very often I'm asked to kind of talk about why persistent identifiers matter and how PIDs are interconnected. And a lot of the times people ask me what PIDs to use and how to incorporate PIDs and how we can have all this stuff interconnect. And that's a big part of it. So for me, this whole thing comes down to 3 or 4 things that we're already moving towards, and I think are probably not that far out of reach. So the first one is sort of a responsible and intentional application of persistent identifiers. So people understanding what PIDs are for, people using PIDs when it makes sense to use them, people knowing which PIDs to select for which projects, and then having some kind of understanding as to where those things are going. I actually think most people are well on their way in this space. I don't think we're really too far off the beaten path. But every now and then I do get a question that just says, like, do I use all of them? And do we turn everything on and push everything to a place? And I'm hoping that in the next few years, a lot of this stuff will be built more into the platforms we use so that we don't personally have to have this conversation as often as we have it. It'll just be kind of more obvious to folks. The other is leveraging open infrastructure. I think I'm going to talk a bit today about OpenAIR, and we receive questions in this space. So often in the Canadian repository space, we've had real conversations about like, well, if we all have these repositories, how do we search them all simultaneously? Or how do we know where all the work is? Or how do I see all of the feces if we're not using ProQuest? Those kinds of questions. And by leveraging the open infrastructure that exists today, even, we can move much closer in that direction. It's just a matter of prioritizing it as projects and thinking about how we want to handle that harvesting and pushing and pulling of content. I think a more collective effort with indexing, especially in OpenAIR, is important. One of the things I feel sort of consistently in working in this space is that every single repository manager feels solely responsible for making sure that the repository is connected to all of the other stuff. And everybody's sort of Googling things from first principles and trying to figure out how to do stuff. I think if we all sort of support each other and share documentation and knowledge, we can help each other figure this out. I have a couple of resources for this down the road. One of them is literally just looking at DSpace and how it pushes content out via OAI, PMH, and Crosswalks. And it wasn't until I started learning about DSpace that I said, oh, I can just go look at the Crosswalk. Like when you have these questions, just knowing where to go can be a huge thing. So I think more collective effort in this space is pretty big. And then the other is this mutual support and shared expertise. I think the existence of this group is a good indication of this, and the conversations that happen on Mattermost. I think when I started in my position like 11 years ago, thinking a little bit about like how to have these conversations with others, it was always very intimidating. Like I knew what I knew, and I kind of knew what other people knew, but I also assumed a lot of people knew things that in fact they probably didn't. And everybody's kind of like ships passing in the night. And I think the more we're upfront about, like, I don't know how to do X, does anybody know how to do X? And then we share that stuff out. That's really big. So for me, all of these sorts of pushes towards open infrastructure, using PIDs responsibly, all of this stuff I think is very much achievable. You know, I'd be happy to say we could all be in OpenAIR in the next few years if we really, you know, throw our backs into it. I think this stuff is easy if we focus on starting with newly ingested content. One of the things with the Scalaris project, I think, like it really does kind of freak you out to think about, okay, well, we've already got tens of thousands of records. How do I make those all findable? That might end up being a lot more work than we can do off of the jump. But I think if we're, you know, moving to new platforms and assigning PIDs and thinking about where metadata goes for new records, that's going to help us kind of get a foothold. And then we can kind of wrap our head around pushing up all of this other content. So yeah, if we focus on appropriate and sustainable use of PIDs, and I'll get to the sustainability stuff in a second, and leverage OpenAIR indexing, we're improving discoverability enormously, and also highlighting the connections between works and funders and institutions that make up the narratives of research. So, you know, you can have a situation potentially, let's say my ideal 4 or 5 years from now is you have to respond to prove that you did the things you needed for your grant funding. You can look up the funder ID somewhere. You can see all of the products of that research and where they are, with, you know, PIDs related to each of those. And that stuff automatically ends up in someone's ORCID account, which they use to apply for more funding instead of filling out a form. I think this is all very doable. It just kind of requires a lot of people to buy into using all of these platforms. Easy is obviously relevant. I think this is well within reach. Question about Scalaris. What's your impression of the Scalaris project so far? I'm optimistic. I'm hugely optimistic. I left this one pretty open. I think one of the things I've seen sort of out east or in smaller institutions is that the cost of hosting your own platform, maybe you don't have an IT group to do it. You don't want to pay a huge amount into software as a service. You don't even totally know which thing you want. Scalaris solves a real need for people to have an up-to-date repository platform that they don't have to maintain in-house. So from a very base level, it's meeting needs for a lot of institutions. For those of us who are on platforms of like an ancient version of DSpace with 1 million customizations, I think it's great to be able to sort of hive all of that off into an overall host and get rid of those customizations. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. But so far, I've been really pleased with the work that's happening in the metadata group, for example. Everybody seems to be really passionate about solving a lot of these problems and making sure we're putting our best foot forward. Scholars Portal have been great. As an Atlantic Canadian who does not typically have access to Scholars Portal, it is the thing that we usually shake our fist at nationally. Or just think, so great, Scholars Portal. Here comes Ontario to rub our faces in their cool resources. not always a fun feeling. But the folks that I've been working with, particularly Julie Gilmore, it's been excellent. I have really no major concerns at this point. They're doing everything, I think, above board, and they're trying to be as transparent with people as possible. They're being careful about who they onboard and how they onboard that stuff. They're very receptive to feedback. I haven't received pushback, I think, on basically anything, which has been really nice. Yeah, it's been really nice. I think one of the things we'll see more of probably is calls related to Scolaris, like the one that happened last week. I did have some feedback based on a lot of questions I got from the community about not really knowing what was happening. As a member of both the advisory and on the metadata groups, I think this is the one weak point, but I think it's also an inevitable weak point when you have like a Carl group overseeing work and then Scholars Portal implementing the work, and it's two completely different groups of people trying to communicate with one sort of unified user base. I think we're going to see a more intentional approach to communication coming from the Scolaris project soon, so that we see more people getting pulled in and more in terms of resources and documentation being shared with folks, and especially as the experts groups get closer to releasing the recommendations we've made. It may not be super obvious, but a lot of that work only really started in the spring. The metadata experts group had their first meeting in like June or late May. So everybody's been sort of hitting the ground running as maximally as possible to get recommendations out. But yeah, no, I'm optimistic. I think it'll be really good. And especially with this more recent piece of conversation where it's on their radar to build like a discovery layer. Hopefully that can harvest other repositories that aren't part of the Scolaris hosted platform. That to me is the biggest potential win of all of Scolaris, is not just that it's a place for people to host content, but can pull in content from other repositories that don't need the hosting service, but do want to be part of the, sometimes I call it the Canada box, one place that just kind of holds Canadian research. So I think that has an enormous potential for the Canadian repository. So yeah, I'm optimistic. East Coast is excited. Yeah, I've been having conversations with the East Coast, trying to figure out how to move things from Islandora, which is a trauma that I have uniquely experienced so far among us. happy to talk about it. Margaret's excited. That's nice. I like when people are excited. So the next question. As an expert who has been involved in multiple repository migrations, you were too kind to call me an expert. What advice can you give to the Scolaris project that will soon be undertaking a massive migration when they begin their work? So fortunately, I'm in a very good position to give advice, being both in the advisory and in an experts group. And I've done a lot of yelling so far about what should be where, and lots of meetings with advisory group people. But before that even happened, I met with Jeff Harder a couple times to talk about specific issues. I'm kind of blessed with opportunities to be pushy. But for me, it's not just Scolaris. I think like one of the things I really, really like about talking to Scholars Portal so far is they have a commitment to contributing back to the DSpace code base. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, but because I work with PKP, it's very common for the community to have needs and then to express them to the developers of OJS or OMP. And then those developers try to prioritize which features they want to add to the software. And then they solve problems system-wide for all users. In Canada, a lot of people have gotten an install of a repository and had someone say, well, we can do basically anything to this you need to make it look or do the things you want. But that means people have stapled a lot of stuff that isn't intrinsic to how the software works independently, or they've asked developers to bend a piece of code to meet a short-term need, and if broken the upgrade path moving forward. So I think both with Scholars Portal and with the repository community, what I'm really trying to stress here is like, let's contribute back to the open source project of DSpace and make it good for everyone. And that's kind of my best piece of advice for both Scholars Portal, but also the community of people who are going to be leveraging the platform, or people who have moved on to DSpace 7. Instead of solving all of these problems locally and independently, let's solve these problems collectively for everyone, so the software is just better. And I think that's really the major piece of advice I'm trying to relay for people who are on the metadata experts group. I probably sound like a broken record at this point, just trying to remind people, yeah, that is a problem. That's a problem for Scholaris to resource, to fix, and contribute code back to DSpace. And we try to just sort of repeat these things. The migration stuff, I think, the big metadata piece that I'm trying to, we're providing a lot of recommendations for, how you want to record your metadata. If you're moving to a new repository, what metadata fields you might want to use, selecting for OpenAIRE, selecting for Library and Archives Canada, trying to make your metadata coherent. I think another piece is like for people to kind of wrap their mind around the fact that metadata only really needs to be consistent within your repository. So for example, you may have 10,000 records where you've used a metadata element I wouldn't personally choose. But if they're all that record and they're all written the same way, that's okay. Like all of this stuff is a little bit more loose than you might think if you're using crosswalks. But working with Scholaris, we also have like a real opportunity to crosswalk metadata that's recorded in a not ideal way into a way that's perhaps a little bit more ideal. So the idea is just catching the problems before they happen. I think for a lot of people who are managing big collections, a real challenge is going to be figuring out what metadata you actually need. A lot of us have recorded metadata that I think serves the purpose of pleasing one person who really wished a thing was in the repository, but it isn't usable downstream by anyone. Let's say we had OpenAIRE indexing. A lot of this stuff just wouldn't be a part of it because it's not anything about a record that anybody cares about other than from an institutional lens. Like when a student graduated, sometimes that's metadata for a thesis. That's metadata about a student. It's not metadata about a thesis. But people have recorded a lot of this stuff because they wanted to have it on a nice page and say, hey, we've got all this stuff. But most of it isn't usable downstream. So trying to figure out what you need and what you want to map over, how much you want to be responsible for, all of that stuff is kind of a big deal. So yeah, it's a good opportunity to take stock. So yeah, I think this opportunity to clean up messes, figure out which stuff you want to keep, which stuff you don't want to keep, which metadata is extraneous, what you can throw out, what you can't, establish some sensible boundaries. So I highlight this. When we first went to Islandora, our developers were very accustomed to Drupal. And one of the questions we got was like, can we add this customization? So you can have anything you want, anything's possible, with the caveat that it may take a long time to make it. And part of the reason we selected DSpace when we came back is our shop is not a Java shop, and they can't really write customization safely. And it gave us an opportunity to say no. So now when someone says, can I get this to do X? We just go, no, it just doesn't do that. We just say no to people. And it turns out they don't really care and probably aren't going to push it. And I think we've already proven our worth in the repository space for what we've already done here. So I don't think we need to say yes just to please folks. So establishing some sensible boundaries around the service and what it does and what it's for, I think are big. And then the sort of repository management piece where we figure out exactly how involved we are in changing the things about repos, like I said before, customizations and other pieces, and just live with what the software does so that our lives are easier in the long run. That's what I'm kind of hoping. But again, it's also an enormous opportunity to engage more directly with an open source software package as a community and potentially contribute to making the software, so to speak. So you can hop into GitHub whenever and look at the issues that are open in DSpace 7 and see what problems they're trying to solve at the moment. You can check to see if people have reported bugs. So you run into a problem, you see if anybody else has that problem. You can see the conversations around how they're fixing problems. All of this stuff is very open. You're just not super used to looking at it. And I think, really embracing a change in let's just make DSpace good for everyone by recommending changes. And maybe if we have developers offering time, that sort of thing. Repository management. We're moving to Scholaris, and we need to decide how much we want to accept in our repository. Should we aim for all faculty publications, even just the metadata if they are closed, or only if they need the repository to fulfill grant requirements? Have best practices in this area changed in the last few years? I'll admit off the top, I don't know what I would call best practice in this space. I think every institution kind of handles this a little bit differently depending on the whims of the person in the role or the whims of the person in the role before you. I'm not confident that there's one way to do this. My opinion, though, is that a repository that just has a different kind of paywall is not super useful. Users can already find a record of the work they can't read, and I don't want my repository to be one of those. So that's my personal line in the sand. You may run into situations where the record makes sense, like a lot of people talk about videos. There isn't really a local open source platform for hosting videos that stream well and aren't enormously resource intensive. So people may want to just share videos in Vimeo or some other place uncompressed and download them or some other result. So every now and then we'll have content where I provide a link to where the content lives, because hosting like a streaming video is not going to happen. But the record's there and they can still get to where the work is. But I would probably never just store a record if I could avoid it. Now, we do have some of these historically that were imported from our old DSpace install, so we do have some of these, but I hate them. I wish I didn't have them. So that's my personal take in that space. Like I say, I think everybody's very different. I'm in this NISO journal article versions working group as a co-chair, and one of the other people in the group is a repository manager in the States. And we often disagree about what's standard in repositories. She'll say, well, the repository community always does this. And I'll go, no, they don't. Nobody does this consistently. So I think a lot of this stuff is just based on your own desires and what you need, or what demands have been from your institution. Some people use their repos kind of like CRIS systems with full lists of publications. Again, I wouldn't use mine that way, but if that's where you are, that's where you are. I especially wouldn't want to have to like migrate and babysit all those records if there was nothing in them, but just my 2 cents. Can you tell us more about your work with metadata schema? How did you make certain decisions regarding DC and open air fields? And do you think DC will map friendly to data site fields? Oh boy. I shared this document in a lot of places, and it's the second link here. It's a document called Comparing Potential Schema that I created when I was prepping to move from Islandora to DSpace. One of the issues for us is that Islandora uses mods, which is a very granular XML schema that's basically like if Mark 21 were XML. So I have a million attributes and elements, and all of these ways I can very granularly describe metadata. Dublin Core is much dumber and much more straightforward. It doesn't really have attributes. It has elements and qualifiers, and it's missing some stuff that you would typically want to engage in this space. So, a good example might be, say, author metadata. An author metadata field in like Crossref or mods or JATs or whatever will say, here's an element for the author with an attribute saying, are they first, are they second, are they corresponding? There's attributes for those. What language is that author writing in? That'll be an attribute. And then maybe an affiliation that's it's a child element for the author. So the affiliation's included, maybe translations for the affiliation. In Dublin Core, it's basically just like author. And that's it. You can have a qualifier for the kind of author, but other metadata about the author isn't really recorded in default Dublin Core because it doesn't really work that way. So I had to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how we would take all this metadata and move it. Fortunately, this meant that a lot of the stuff that's recorded by open air fields in DSpace 7 are included in the open air namespace in the software. So I could take stuff like journal number and issue, volume, first page, last page. I had a place to put that because we had it in mods and we could put it in this place. But if I had to put citation information into default Dublin Core, it would go in a text field that some of you put in DC terms, description, bibliographic citation, or identifier bibliographic citation, which is just a big citation. And that's much less useful than all of the granular broken down chunks of metadata. So if you ever feel like following a person's path into madness, that comparing potential schema document is like a toe-to-tip justification for the decisions we made moving into. I wrote it for myself so that I could keep all this stuff straight, but it turns out it's really handy to share with others. But for this last question, do you think DC will map cleanly to data site fields? So I've included a link here to the DSpace crosswalk directory, and in it, it'll show you the data site field, and it'll show you in that crosswalk what maps to what in data site. Out of the box, it maps very cleanly, but if you're migrating a bunch of metadata that doesn't use metadata the same way DSpace 7 does out of the box, that won't, and you'll have to kind of move it in line with the crosswalk. But by default, a lot of DC maps very cleanly to data site fields. I do want to provide maybe a breather for questions here, if there are any questions specifically about sort of metadata schema and what's going where and what's compatible. And so I can breathe because I've been talking very quickly.
I have one if nobody else wants to jump in. And you can think while I talk, while Mike breathes. For the identifiers, like if you're assigning identifiers in your repository versus like putting in publisher identifiers, there's like URIs, there's different kinds of DOIs. Is the crosswalk the best place to figure out like what that actually says to open air? Like how do you go about figuring out like the relationship between like your submission form versus what actually goes out into the wild?
Right. So in that same crosswalk directory, you can see the OAI PMH crosswalks for OpenAir. I don't remember which subsection it is. Let's just take a look since we're streaming live. So here's the datasite one at the top. And then if I go to OAI, and then I say transformers, here's OpenAir and OpenAir 4. So we'll open up OpenAir 4. So this is just an XSLT file. And XSLT can be a little bit inscrutable to read, but you can still kind of get a sense as to what's happening in an XSLT file. So here's our language metadata at the top. And let's say I want to look at identifiers. Oh, I'm not getting any luck on a search for identifiers. So this is a good example. So here's DC type. I'm expecting lowercase metadata. This is like the beauty of a live demo where I just look to see how borked things are. So here's type designations. So it's looking for a DC type of working paper. And if it sees working paper in the core vocabulary, it'll make sure it says working paper here. So it's basically just running through DC type to map all of your potential types against core vocabulary directly to the language that exists in OpenAir, which ought to match. So that's the thing we're seeing there. Here's some date format information about how it's changing date formats. Templates for either all small case or all uppercase. It might just be that 4 is not as busy as the original OpenAir. Look for identifiers there either. Oh, this one's short too. Maybe I want metadata formats. OAI OpenAir. Yeah, here's our guy. Right. So you'd be browsing this thing and looking for identifiers. Boy, everybody loves the live demo. That works really great while I search for metadata. Templates, data site titles. So in the top part, you'll see what it's looking for in Dublin Core. And then on the bottom part, you'll see how it's going to write it. Stock element name, contributor, author, variable name is org unit entity. So some of these are, one of the things that's happening in DSpace 7 is the adoption of these things called entities. And for OpenAir to work, you need to have entities configured. And entities do what's referred to as like virtual metadata for those entities in specific. So I just talked about how like author metadata in Dublin Core is bad. But if you have people entities configured in DSpace, you can record all kinds of virtual metadata that isn't beholden to just Dublin Core for each of the authors that write in your platform. And that metadata is getting pushed to specific places in the OpenAir namespace here. Yeah, this is a real boondoggle of Googling around, but this is where we would make all the decisions about what goes where. So you can see at any point. And it will have, when we release the metadata recommendations from the experts group, we spell out a bunch of this stuff for both OpenAir crosswalks, LAC crosswalks, and then just like a general, if you were just having general Dublin Core, here's where you should probably put things. But in any case where we're trying to figure out where to record metadata, we check the crosswalks. There's a really good example actually I could think of is the DC creator field. So for many people, they put their author in a DC creator element. And we had sort of conflicting recommendations in the experts group when we started. That I already migrated and had chosen DC contributor author. And people were saying, well, why aren't you using DC creator? That's where it's supposed to go. And in some digging, discovered that the reason that DSpace 7 defaults to DC contributor author is because it automatically crosswalks to creator for the places that are looking for it as part of the default crosswalk. So if you've recorded creator, you don't need to necessarily worry about the crosswalk. But if you're using DC contributor author, it's pushing that metadata in specific places. So I'd recommend for anybody, you can see the default, if you go to dspace config, you can see their default item submission and submission forms here and get a sense where they're writing all of that stuff now in the default form. The beauty of this being open source is that at any point, I can just look at what they've done with default code and get a sense as to what DSpace does out of the box and how I might want to change it down the road. So these are their default forms and how they're writing all of that metadata by default. So a lot of the decisions around this is like, how do we take the default form as simple as possible, add some stuff to it, move on with our lives, instead of how do I rewrite this entire enormous form to do the very special thing I want? We just have it be as simple as possible so that we have less to break. So hopefully that answers some questions about this. I know that live demo wasn't super great, but go dig around those XSLTs. It is worth doing it. Like, you can learn a lot about who's putting what where by just digging in. Thank you, Priscilla. That's a nice thing to say for something that felt like was a real, real whiff. This is another thing that is close to my heart. If you see me present on this kind of stuff recently, I feel very strongly about this. Any best practices for high-level structure and collections by school? My recommendation is don't. Just don't stop. I don't think it's useful for anybody, except people whose opinion you probably shouldn't care about. I put in here, keep it simple. So some schools have already migrated to 7 and have kept their collection structure very, very simple. Ours is probably a little busier than some. Because I don't have one big bucket with just like a couple small buckets in it. I've sorted things by type and by community first. So our communities are sorted by faculty, graduate, undergraduate, and research institutes. And then within the faculty works, it's by type. But corpus at U of L, if at any point you have a question, and I know he's on the call, if you ever say like, I don't know what to do, you should just say, what would Pierre do? And then do what Pierre would do. Pierre Lesueur has spent a lot of time thinking about this stuff, is an active contributor with the DSpace community, spends a lot of time thinking about these concerns. And I met with him repeatedly before our migration to make sure that I was on the same page as him, because it just seemed like we were sort of both leaning in the same direction of sensible collections management. This works in kind of 2 ways. One is that if you migrate to Scolaris and you want to maintain all of those collections, you're going to have to map what you're maintaining and what you're pushing where. You're going to need to think about the starting point and the end point and have these numerous collections to check, individual permissions for and all of this other stuff. If you have one big bucket, you're moving a bunch of stuff into one big bucket. And then when you want to edit that stuff, say via a big Excel spreadsheet, and you want to edit all the records simultaneously, you have one to open and not a bajillion small collection records to open. It will make your life easier. One of the reasons I feel so strongly about this is that I don't think people browse repositories except busybodies and other librarians. And generally the idea is just to go, what do we have? And then you look. But what we're trying to do is expose research to people who are Googling or searching in other places and providing open versions of those things. Those people are not going to the repository first. And we do absolutely know that. So I think just making sure the stuff is available is way more important than recreating a hierarchy of faculties and departments that will result in a person clicking 7 or 8 times in a list and getting one document because that department only uploaded one thing. I think it's just, from an organizational standpoint, it's just really frustrating. Even when I use the repository to find something, it's really obnoxious to have to dig through all of these layers. You just don't have to do it. So ask yourself if you can get away with it. Guelph has also done this. So I put 3 examples here: Laval, ourselves, and Guelph. Jordan Peterson, who's my co-chair in the Metadata Experts Group, has talked about how great it is to have research, theses, and other as the buckets in the repository, and that's enough. And this has worked out very well for them. They're quite happy with this. And then within it, your individual facets for searching are plenty. It solves all of their needs. I'd recommend doing this just for your own sanity. It's less to maintain. if somebody changes their department name, you don't have to go and fix 25 things. It's just an easier way to go. So that's my recommendation. Or try to keep it as simple as you can. Part of the reason I went this route too is UNB has 2 campuses. There's a Fredericton campus and a St. John campus. And in the Fredericton campus, for example, we have the Faculty of Management. And in the St. John campus, it's the business faculty. They're independent and they have the same stuff, but different departmental names. And I just couldn't do it anymore. This stuff is now just recorded as business or management by subject, case closed. So yeah. Please take it as a good excuse to not have to care about this. Again, I'm not confident I would call this a best practice, but I think a sane one is how I feel. I don't think a ton of people are doing this yet because a lot of people still have legacy platforms they've been holding their stuff in for forever. But this one I think is really important. So take it as a good excuse to just make it much more simple. We have one comment that just said PIDs. I said, this is more of a question than a comment. PIDs are, I think the one thing I wanted to highlight here is the CIPIDAC group, the Persistence Identifier Advisory Committee, is probably not far from having a national strategy document to share out. People ask me about PIDs all the time. Which one should I use? What should I use? And there's a question coming up about this. All I ask is like, don't ascribe to like PID fever. Like think about what gets PIDs, and if it makes sense for you, know what you do and do not have to care about. ROR is a very good example. ROR will be included in platforms when we can use it. You're not going to have to worry about implementing ROR at your institution. DSpace will have ROR if necessary. Crossref and DataCite already have it. ORCID can use ROR. You don't need to worry like, how do I make ROR work in my platform? Someday DSpace will update and ROR will be there. You don't have to stress about it. The stuff's just going to get sorted out. Just like you didn't have to write your own ORCID plugins, those are also included in the software you run. The question about what DOI registration agency you pick is nuanced, and you have to think about the answers to those questions. There is no one default yes. It's all pros and cons. So use PIDs and relax. I think are my 2 big pieces of advice here. In a related way, what approach should we take with minting things in repositories with DOIs? Should everything get a DOI? Please don't do this. I don't know what purpose it serves. Everything already gets a handle, right? In DSpace, handles are very useful. They're a persistent link. They do the thing that most people think PIDs do by default. If you see a handle and you click it, it takes you to where the work is. That's most of what people want a PID to do. That works for citation. That works for all kinds of things. The thing that a DOI does that a handle doesn't is it also comes attached to a fulsome metadata record, which you can push to other places like ORCID or Crossref or DataCite. And that can appear in other places like OpenAlex or OpenAir or these other places. So it has sort of a downstream effect of sharing a location of this work that you might not otherwise have found. But something we share a lot of is open access versions of existing publications that already have DOI. So to me, it doesn't make any sense to register a new DOI for an accepted manuscript of a work that already has a DOI. That metadata is already in the wild. It's already in Crossref or DataCite. I don't need to push that back up. I don't need one more DOI to manage. And this is the other part. When you register a DOI, you're not just done with DOIs. If you move your content, you have to update all of them. If you remove content, you have to put up a tombstone and then update the metadata to point to that place. It's not just like set it and forget it. We've seen a lot of research this year about like how DOIs are no longer resolving to where the work is, and they're not meeting the promise. That's because people don't update them. It's your responsibility as the member who registered all of them to also update them all, make sure the metadata is good and usable, that all of the metadata you're recording in your publication is going in the place it ought to. So let's say I modify my metadata, but I never change the DataCite schema. Well, maybe I'm not pushing abstracts, or maybe I'm not pushing name fields correctly. It's your responsibility to make sure that you're handling those things in a reasonable way. I do think there's intrinsic value in DOIs for theses and dissertations. And this is a thing that a lot of people are leaning towards. I think for me, what I love, so one of the big differences between Crossref and DataCite is that Crossref includes all of the reference metadata, or can, for a publication. So you can see other places it was cited, and you can kind of follow a citation listing using the Crossref API to figure out where that work has gone. And DataCite doesn't do that. Crossref is more publisher flavored, and DataCite's typically more repository flavored. I think Crossref DOIs for Thikis would be sick, but if I try to think about where to put references in Dublin Core, it does make me want to rip my own head off. there's no way to do a big thing of references in Dublin Core that is sensible and doesn't just make everybody's item record balloon with a bunch of stuff you never want to look at. And DSpace isn't super great at pushing content to Crossref just yet. I would say it's certainly better at using DataCite. So if you really wanted to use DOIs and you were using DSpace, I'd say DataCite DOIs for anything that doesn't already have one. So for Greylit, reports, other stuff that doesn't have a DOI that's public, by all means, give it one if you want, as long as you're willing to maintain the metadata. But don't, if you could just leave it off of the stuff that already has one, I think that would help. I don't think we need to recreate the problem of URLs, which is that we have a million of them and none of them take us to the place. When we have a DOI for everything, I think we just recreated URLs, but with significantly more complexity. And I don't think that's particularly useful. So that's the route I would recommend. I included a link here to an early blog. It's 2013, written by Jeff Builder, who's one of the folks who helped found Crossref, talking about this distinction between duplicates of DOIs, whether or not it's good or bad, how DOIs are supposed to work. And I think it's a really, really good read for people who are just trying to get their head wrapped around what DOIs are and are for. Very often we have this discussion about like, oh, it's for research. It isn't. You can assign a DOI to anything at all. And so Jeff really leans into that conversation about what DOIs are for and what their intent is supposed to be. But they're not 100% all the time. So does everything need a DOI is a question you should be asking. Not like, should I just give it one, but does it need to have one? And internally you ask the question, are you going to maintain them when you move your content or move stuff around? Handles are totally fine. Handles are great. They do most of what people think DOIs do by default, and they're very, very, very cheap. If you only use handles, that's okay. Discoverability. How can we best communicate to faculty the impact that depositing their articles into an institutional repository has? It might just be my own cynicism, but I put keep your expectations low. I kind of, I don't know. If I had an answer to this question, I probably would be in a completely different position than the one I'm in. I don't totally know how to answer this question. I mean, usually when I'm talking to faculty, I just say, hey, an open access version of your work needs more eyes on your work, period. If they're working in a field that has a lot of people who are practitioners in public, like my partner's a dietitian. So when I'm talking to people in like nursing or kinesiology or other people, I say like, look, if you are writing work that you're hoping will be seen by people who are employees of public health, it better be open access. Because I'll tell you, none of our governments are interested in spending more money on collections for public health. They're just not going to see it. So making sure that practitioners can see your work is huge. And I try to relay this to them as much as possible. To me, that works okay. The difference is like, there's a big difference between someone nodding at me sagely as though they believe the thing I'm saying is important and them actually following up. And that's a much different conversation. And I don't really know how to square those things other than just to be approachable and make yourself as available as possible and help people where you need to. But I say keep your expectations low. I think in particular, so this is a kind of a more important thing for me. So a lot of people who end up in Scalcom's positions are early career. It's like their first job out of school or maybe their second. And you're trying to figure out both an institution and how that institution works and a new platform, while being stressed out that you're not going to be able to pass whatever evaluations you need to make. And I think because the job is activism, I always say like Scalcom's work is activism. It's like being paid to be an anti-capitalist in some ways, saying information should be free. These publishers are villains, and you're trying to advocate for open work. So it's activism, and activism can be something that can really take a lot out of you. We see this in narratives these days where people are talking about, oh, I'm fighting for pro-Palestine cause. Isn't progress here so brutal? How do I handle this? It doesn't seem like we're making any difference. Well, people have been fighting for that cause for 4 generations, and not being able to see visible movement doesn't mean you're not making a difference. So it's okay, I think, to give yourself a little bit of grace when you're having these longer term conversations about changing publishing culture. to not beat yourself up too much when you don't see stuff change in an enormous way. I mean, the Budapest Open Access Initiative is 20 years old. Uh, and we haven't solved open access. Like, it's still a problem. So yeah, just be kind to yourself and try to get through to people where you can. I also say, like, don't waste your time on brick walls. Like, if you run into someone who is into it, spend your time with the people who are useful and into it than trying to convince somebody who doesn't give a shit. It's, oh, you're always going to have a better time, and I think you'll feel better and they'll feel better, and that other person can just fail at this thing, and that's not your responsibility either. So these are my pieces of advice here. How can we incorporate repository profiles and uploading publications into the repository in a wider project of helping faculty demonstrate their research impact? First of all, I could give a shit about helping faculty demonstrate their research impact. I don't care about this at all. I think research impact is nonsense. But what I do care about is saving researchers time and improving access to and discoverability of their works. I think their work should be as publicly accessible as possible because it's a public good. And I don't want them to have to fill out the same form 78 times in order to do it. So I think getting stuff into ORCID is huge. And I think literacy around ORCID is big. And it has to happen at like an author by author level. If the authors haven't bought into ORCID, you're not going to be able to pull any metadata from it. You need people connecting ORCID to stuff like Crossref and data sites so they're getting populated when they publish. And they're probably not going to do this stuff without a little bit of help or a little bit of nagging. Early career researchers maybe have done a bit more of this than others, but I think literacy around ORCID could really be hugely beneficial here. And the other thing I want to talk about, you see some people work at schools that have gotten a CRIS system like Vivo or DSpace CRIS or, God forbid, UniWeb. And so have some sort of conversation around how to sort of promote the works of faculty. The use of the person or people entities in DSpace 7 does facilitate kind of having a landing page for a researcher with all of the linked metadata for all of their publications in it. And that's the closest I would say to a profile existing. So if you're deciding to move to Scholaris, get the people entity configured off the jump, and use that in order to sort of have these profiles. That would be the quickest route to here. Are the best practices for metadata reuse pushing and pulling to other systems such as RIMS? Are there integrations with DSpace with RIM systems so that we're entering data only once? Boy, the dream, wouldn't it? We're using it in other systems. How best to take advantage of them? Aside from tech requirements, are there policy requirements, others? So my hope is that PIDs will do this work for us. This is the sort of the end goal of PIDs, right? Assuming we use them and assuming the research management software can leverage them, and assuming publishers provided the metadata at the point of publication in a way that is responsible, which is like, maybe. Publishers actually really aren't that great at registering metadata accurately for the PIDs they register. Springer in particular, boy, howdy. Assuming a PID was registered for the work in the first place, if there's no PID, it's not going to go anywhere. Assuming authors have allowed for access to ORCID, and assuming that an author has configured ORCID to ingest metadata from DOI registration agencies, and. So there's all of this stuff kind of standing in the way. PIDs assigned at the point of publication, so that stuff is open and pullable via ORCID. Authors connecting all of that stuff to ORCID, assuming that something had a PID in the first place. But all of the research management systems that are good can connect to ORCID. So if it's connected to ORCID, and that author's using an ORCID record when they publish, they include the ORCID in their publication metadata, the work gets published, it gets a DOI from that publisher almost always, and then Crossref or data site automatically push that work into someone's ORCID record. So assuming all of that is set up, and then you have access to their ORCID record using an ORCID member API and a system like Symplectic Elements or maybe Vivo or DSpace CRIS or whatever other platform is pulling from ORCID, then it should just happen when they publish or when they update their ORCID record, which would be the dream. And then if the tri-agency with their new grant management system includes ORCID ingest, then we're golden. Then you just pull from ORCID. So ORCID is really the best way to go here. I think that's my short and long-term recommendation, is just try to invest some more time into ORCID and getting people on it. And then whether or not your research management or your research office is doing the same thing, when they eventually figure out that they can pull from ORCID, you'll be able to say, yeah, a ton of our faculty use them. And you can talk to your faculty about how to get that stuff harvested. Is the Canadian landscape sophisticated enough to do the work that is required for discoverability via repositories? I love this question. I think so. But I don't think sophistication is the issue so much as cultural and political buy-in. I think there are a lot of so this idea of a national platform, the Scholarist hosts that harvests from all these other publications, I think that's potentially huge, right? Like if our stuff is in OpenAIR, and say in Google Scholar, but I'd say OpenAIR is maybe even more important, then I think we've already fixed a lot of the discoverability via repository stuff. As long as it's available in a big place that people can search that is shared in open scholarly infrastructure, that's a huge win. But it's, for any individual institution, a non-trivial amount of work to make that happen. So you have to migrate your stuff to Scholarist, enable entities, wrap your head around how to use them and where the metadata should go, how you backport all of your existing records into the new entities. This is something that the metadata experts group has a line out to the OpenAIR task force about how to sort of accommodate. I've got a bunch of existing stuff. How do I move it into entities? So I don't have an answer for this. But Pierre and Gabriella might have answers for this in due course, and a few other folks who are on that group. But I think we are sophisticated enough, and I don't think it'll take much longer as we sort of move into platforms that are hosted by these things. What I can't speak to is like how much labor you have at your institution to do this work, right? And in a lot of cases where ITS isn't doing it, you're going to have to rely on something like Scholars Portal to do that work for you. Or if you're fully independent and you don't move to a platform, let's say you're running your own software, let's say you decided to use Samvera or Hydra years ago, and you've got your own platform and you don't really want to move because it's going to be expensive. You like hosting your own because it's very cheap to host your own. That's going to be a real challenge for you to get your development team to build the things necessary to push to that place. So it's going to depend in a case-by-case basis. But I think that with like the influx of clients and attention to Scholarist, a discoverability front end that harvests all these repositories, that, like, to me, we're very close to this. I think just a few more years and we'll be talking. Bonus round questions. WorldCat Digital Collection Gateway, shout out. Is it possible for DCG not to push certain DC contributors fields? For example, DC contributor affiliation causes problems because it is pushed to the author field in the bibliographic records of our tool. I have bad news. DC contributor affiliation is not metadata about a contributor necessarily, and DC contributor affiliation is not a metadata term that I would use in Dublin Core at all. It's a custom qualifier. So in Dublin Core, there's an expectation that all metadata ascribes to the dumb down rule, where any metadata in a qualifier has to match the expectations of the element itself. Contributor is expecting the name of a contributor, not an affiliation related to that contributor. And there's no relationship between the two in Dublin Core. So it's just going to take anything a DC contributor and jam it into that space. So if you want to record affiliation, you should use a different metadata element. DC doesn't really have a place to store metadata about authors beyond their name. But if you do use entities in DSpace 7, you can do this by having information about authors in that virtual metadata in entities. Why are articles that are in our institutional repository not flagged as open access by Google Scholar, especially in the author profile? Can we do something about it? I'll be honest, I try to think about Google Scholar as little as possible. Almost all of their indexing is based not on available metadata and open infrastructure. They don't really use DOIs or ORCID or any of that stuff. And they scrape web pages using meta tags, which is the technology the internet has had. You probably wrote a blog at some point where you populated meta tags. That's how Google Scholar works. It works on meta tags. All I have for anybody in this space is guesses. You may have luck trying to reach their contacts. I'll say Google Scholar is about 12 people tops, and they don't all work full time. They're not well resourced. They're doing their absolute best, but they do work for one of the most ghoulish organizations on the planet, and they have no money. So you can try to reach them. Anytime we've talked to them, they've been genuinely nice. So you can try to talk to them. All of the answers will depend on what platform you use and how you store and reveal access metadata. I can't really reveal much more beyond that because it depends. Every platform would share content related to Google Scholar in a different way. But when something doesn't get picked up by Google Scholar, right, I was just kind of shrug and go, yeah, Google Scholar for you. It's not, it's a black box. They're not upfront about it, and they don't use open infrastructure. I'm sorry if that's not super helpful. My recommendation broadly is just to care less about Google Scholar, and maybe that'll help. And then this last question, bonus round, I'm working for a university adjacent nonprofit, and we want to create a document repository for university members to be able to access the resources in. What are the steps we need to take to do this? I highly recommend, in this case, if access management isn't an issue or everything can just be public, just make a collection in Zenodo and put things in it, and don't build your own box because you're going to have to maintain it. And that Zenodo collection probably isn't going anywhere. Zenodo is funded by CERN, and those nerds have a lot of money. So just jam stuff in Zenodo in a collection and relax, I think is what I would say. If it's all the same to you. So yeah, thanks for letting me answer questions, and thanks for having good questions. And hopefully any of this has been useful and you don't think I'm a big tool.
Thanks so much, Mike. Perfect timing. Appreciate it. Well done. Thanks. And yeah, the slides, the links in the chat, and I'm also going to stick the link for the survey in here again. So thank you everybody so much for a wonderful first event. And I'll see you on Mattermost and at other future events. Thank you all so much. And thanks again, Mike. Take care.
Thank you.